I'm Shelby Novak from White River Valley Electric Cooperative in Branson, Missouri. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
Support for this podcast comes from Hendrix by Marmon Utility, a partner committed to helping America's electric cooperatives build wildfire-resilient grids. Hendrix aerial cable systems are engineered to perform in fire-prone environments where reliability matters most.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm Molly Christian, guest hosting for Scott Hoffman. Today, we're discussing the existential threat of wildfires to electric co-ops. Drier and hotter weather conditions are creating longer wildfire seasons in many parts of the country, and even regions not typically at risk of wildfires are vulnerable. Wildfires can decimate electric infrastructure, destroy homes and businesses, and worst of all, lead to injury or loss of life for those in their path. Today, we'll talk about an upcoming RE Magazine story on this issue and how a bill in Congress, the Fix Our Forests Act, could help co-ops deal with this challenge. Our guests include Erin Kelly, a reporter for NRECA who's covered the impact of wildfires on our members. We'll also talk to Hannah Hardin with NRECA's Legislative Affairs team on smart policies to combat wildfires. And last but not least, I'll interview Billi Kohler, General Manager of West Oregon Electric Cooperative, which dealt with a wildfire in its service territory in 2020. But before we talk to our guests, I'll let you know a little bit about me. So as I mentioned, I'm Molly Christian, and I'll be doing more of our podcasts in the coming months as a guest host for Scott Hoffman. When I'm not hosting Along Those Lines, I write about federal policies affecting co-ops, everything from environmental rules for power plants to federal grant programs that co-ops can use to build new projects. Before joining NRECA in 2024, I was a longtime energy industry reporter in Washington, D.C. And before that, I grew up in Ohio and attended Ohio University, where I majored in journalism. In my role as a reporter, I recently traveled to Oregon with my colleague, Erin Kelly, a fellow digital reporter and writer for NRECA. We talked to 3 co-ops and some of the people they serve on the state's devastating September 2020 wildfires. Today, I'm getting some of Erin's observations on the trip and why the issue of wildfires is so huge for our members. Erin, welcome.
Thanks, Molly. Great to be here.
So we went to Western Oregon in February as part of the story we're doing for the July issue of RE Magazine, and we heard from some co-ops on their wildfire experiences. Let's listen to a clip from Billi Kohler with West Oregon Electric Cooperative on how they're affected.
I'm often asked as a utility manager what keeps me up at night, and I would say that wildfire threat is at the top of that list. It's really disheartening as a utility manager to see all that we invest into vegetation management to clear our right-of-ways, but the millions of trees that surround the outside of our right-of-ways that can come down and spark a fire at any moment.
So that clip gives us a sense of what we heard. Erin, give us a rundown of this trip and what stood out for you.
I think the thing that really stands out for me was the heart-wrenching stories that we heard from co-op consumer members who survived this really nightmarish wildfire season back in 2020. We talked to a couple who woke up in the middle of the night only to find their house on fire, their 2 cars exploding in their driveway. They had to run out with nothing but their clothes on their back, scramble up this really steep hillside behind their house and make it to the highway. And then they were still trapped, but fortunately for them, there were some campers who were lost, who were trying to get out, and they had a vehicle and they could give them a ride, but they didn't know the way out because all the major highways were closed. So these folks were able to guide these campers out of the area safely. And so it ended up being kind of a miracle for both of them. None of them would have been able to get out without the other. Then we had another story that was equally dramatic about a couple who got trapped in the McKenzie Valley part of Oregon, and they ended up spending the night on a public running track with about 30 of their friends and neighbors. And they had embers basically raining down on them all night long as they were in their cars there. And luckily a fire truck had actually gotten stuck in this valley with them, and it was circling the cars and spraying them so that the embers wouldn't catch the cars on fire. And they really weren't sure they were going to survive the night. They talked about how, at least if they were going to die, they were going to be together, this couple who'd been married for a long time. So those were the kind of stories that we heard about this hell that they really went through with these wildfires that burned hundreds of thousands of acres. And what struck me also was how badly they wanted to stay in those communities even after everything that happened.
Yeah, just really devastating circumstances that I think we can't really imagine living through unless you've actually gone through it. How is the rebuilding process going for these communities and the co-ops 5 years later?
There were a lot of signs of hope. The one thing that I don't think that most people would realize is how long it takes to rebuild after something that devastating. So we were there 4.5 years later, and they were just now rebuilding, for example, this really key general store that was important to this little community that had burned down in the fire. And finally, they were pouring the foundation when we were there in February visiting. So that's going to be rebuilt. And then also the co ops themselves, everyone talked about how great they were at getting the power restored right away after the fires, but it takes a long time to really harden your system after something like that. So they're doing things, for example, like putting their electric utility lines underground, replacing their wooden poles with fire resistant poles, going after vegetation that can spark fires near their lines. But that kind of thing takes a lot of money and a lot of time. It's slow going, but they're definitely making progress.
So, yeah, as you said, the co ops, everyone said how quickly they work to get power back. They're making all these investments to make their systems stronger and more durable. But what else do co ops think they need to be prepared for these situations and to respond and recover quickly from wildfires? What else do they need?
One thing they really need is support from their lawmakers. It takes years sometimes to get a permit to remove a tree or even a tree limb from federal property that could fall into an electric line and spark a fire. So they really need some help making the whole system safer for them and their consumer members.
Thanks, Erin. And next, we're going to talk to Hannah Hardin, Senior Manager of Legislative Affairs for NRECA on the Fix Our Forests Act, a bill in Congress that could help co ops deal with the challenge of wildfires.
Welcome, Hannah.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So when Molly and I were in Oregon in February, we saw how some co-ops were taking action to bury some of their electric lines underground, replace their wooden poles with fire-resistant models, remove vegetation near their rights-of-way. A lot of these things require permits from the federal government. How would the Fix Our Forests Act that NRECA is supporting in Congress make it easier for co-ops to get these permits that they need?
Yeah, that's a great observation, and very grateful that you two were able to make that trip and see what's going on the ground in Oregon. Those kind of upgrades and preventative measures are really important, especially in places like rural Oregon that is vulnerable to wildfires. But you're also right in the fact that one of the biggest hurdles that co ops face is the federal permitting process. It can be incredibly slow and complicated, even when the work is clearly aimed at improving safety and reliability. So, the Fix Our Forests Act that you mentioned would help fix that issue by streamlining some of those permitting requirements. It would make it faster and simpler for co ops to get approved for projects like burying power lines or replacing those wooden poles with newer, more fire resistant materials, or even just trimming back trees and brush that could pose a threat to our electrical infrastructure. Right now, even small scale projects like routine maintenance get delays because of environmental permitting processes. And if you need an access road to get to your own poles and wires to conduct that routine maintenance, that's going to need an environmental review too. An example of one of the ways this bill will help our members is that it'll allow co ops to remove felled timber from our rights of way without having to go through a formal timber sales process. So, right now, if we want to remove fallen trees, timber that poses a threat to our equipment, those trees are on public land. So, they aren't ours, and we would have to appraise and sell that timber back to the federal government. This bill would cut that requirement for our members so that they can focus on safety and reliability. And if any of that sounds familiar, this language is from the Fire Safe Electrical Corridors Act, which NRECA has advocated for. So the bill as a whole cuts through a lot of this red tape so that co ops can act more quickly. And it doesn't mean that there's less environmental oversight, more so means that the safety upgrades don't get stuck in limbo and that we aren't doing so many redundant reviews.
As you well know, Hannah, one of the biggest dangers that co-ops face is trees falling from federal land onto co-op power lines and potentially sparking fires. Co-ops can only remove these hazard trees immediately. They're within 10 feet of co-op rights of way. How will the legislation change that?
So, as it stands now, co ops are only allowed to remove hazard trees, as you mentioned, if they're in that very narrow margin. So, basically, a 10-foot buffer from the edge of their right of way. But as you can imagine, trees don't respect those boundaries. A dead or dying tree that's just outside that zone could fall during a storm, during high winds, and bring down a power line, which could easily spark a wildfire, especially in dry conditions or on protected lands where these trees are growing 50, 80, 100 feet tall and have the power to do some serious damage. So, back to your original question, the Fix Our Forest Act would expand the authority of co ops to deal with these hazard trees from that narrow 10-foot buffer to up to 150 feet outside the right of way. So, this is going to give co ops a much more reasonable zone to work with land management agencies to essentially be able to proactively identify and remove more of those trees that are hazardous before they cause a problem. And this is a big deal. I mean, it shifts the focus from reacting to disasters after they happen to preventing them in the first place. We talk about the tools in the toolbox often that electric co ops use to do what it takes to keep the lights on. And I think that this is a great example of one of those tools that gives co ops more ability to manage vegetation in a practical way while still closely coordinating with federal agencies to protect the environment.
That would be a huge change. One of the things that Molly and I heard over and over again from the co-ops in Oregon was that litigation is a huge concern for co-ops when it comes to wildfires. What impact would the Fix Our Forest Act have on lawsuits?
Yeah, you are spot on. Co ops are very vulnerable to litigation. They can do everything by the book, maintain their lines, clear vegetation, they can inspect their equipment regularly, and still be hit with lawsuits if a wildfire starts near or due to their infrastructure being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Additionally, co ops serve 56% of the nation's land mass, so that just equates to more public lands to cross, more vegetation to be responsible for. You've also got to factor in that in many cases, the legal costs alone can be devastating, even if the co op isn't found to be at fault, which is especially hard given our utilities are not for profit and they're ratepayer funded. So, the Fix Our Forest Act, fortunately, makes it harder for courts to block or delay wildfire prevention projects unless there's a clear and serious environmental harm. And even if a court does find an issue with a project, this bill is setting firmer timelines and allowing unaffected parts of the project to keep moving forward. I'd also add that the bill's expanded use of categorical exclusions would lessen co op's exposure to litigation that would be more likely after full NEPA review. This is not removing accountability, it just ensures that wildfire mitigation projects aren't unfairly held up, and it's giving our members more certainty. Co ops need to stay focused on safety and disaster prevention. This bill enables that.
So, Hannah, the House passed this bill in January with a strong bipartisan vote, and the bill has been introduced in the Senate. How are things looking there?
Chairman Westerman and Congressman Scott Peters should be very proud of their leadership on the House side. It was incredibly encouraging to see the House pass this bill with such strong bipartisan support. That kind of regular order unity doesn't happen every day here in Washington. So the fact that lawmakers from both parties got behind this bill showed that this wasn't a red or blue issue or a rural versus urban issue, but more so that our lawmakers showed they cared about public safety and they care about protecting our communities. Now, the bill has been introduced in the Senate for the first time following House passage and also in a bipartisan fashion. So, the Senate bill has two Republican senators leading, Senator Curtis and Sheehy, and two Democratic senators, Senators Padilla and Hickenlooper. So, like with most legislation in the Senate, the pace can be a little bit slower. Reconciliation is taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room for many staff right now. But positives are that this bill is addressing clear and present dangers, and it has been proven to draw wide support. So, for what it's worth, so far, it's been moving quickly. There have been two hearings on the bill in the Senate Agriculture Committee, and following the second hearing, Forest Service provided extensive technical assistance on the bill. So now staff have to go back to the drawing board with that technical assistance, work that in before they go to markup and vote the bill out of committee. NRECA is one of many organizations that want to see this bill get to the president's desk and amongst many organizations that are advocating for its quick passage. So All this being said, I would characterize the current outlook as cautiously optimistic, as we do many things in DC. While we're not across the finish line just yet, the bill is in a good position, and we're going to keep advocating that the Senate continue moving in the right direction.
Great. So it sounds like a positive outlook for this bill and a lot of bipartisan support. So we'll keep an eye on that. Hannah, thanks for joining us and telling us about this bill and what the next steps could be. It's been great having you on. Thanks so much.
Thank you all so much. Greatly appreciate the opportunity.
And now let's listen to Ted Case, Executive Director of the Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative Association, on the importance of smart policies around wildfires. We recorded this clip with Ted for this RE Magazine story that we're doing for July.
I think it's one of the most perilous times that we've had in the entire history of our 80 years of our program. I'm hopeful going forward, but I think it's going to take state legislation, it's going to take federal legislation, it's going to take a partnership to be able to get through this. This is not an issue that's going away, and this is not just an Oregon issue. I know my colleagues in Idaho, in Montana, in Wyoming, and other states are also working on this. So this is not a West-wide issue. This is happening all over the United States. Wildfire is just not a Western issue. And so I think this is a long-term issue. I'm glad NRECA is a partner in this because we're going to need the full force of both the state government and the federal government to fix this problem.
Let's pause here for a word from our sponsor, and when we come back, I'll talk to Billi, Kohler, General Manager of West Oregon Electric Cooperative, on how the co-op is dealing with the risk of wildfires.
Along Those Lines is made possible by Hendricks by Marmon Utility, who wants you to know that wildfire threats demand smarter grid solutions. Hendricks spacer cable systems are proven in high-risk fire zones, helping co-ops reduce ignition potential while maintaining service reliability across rough terrain. With decades of experience and on-the-ground engineering support, Hendricks equips co-ops to strengthen their overhead infrastructure in the face of climate risk. Learn more at marmonutility.com/wildfire mitigation.
I'm Nicole Christensen from Tennessee Electric Cooperative Association in Nashville. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
And we're back. Now I'm going to talk to West Oregon Electric Cooperative General Manager Billi Kohler. Billi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So wildfires are a growing issue for co-ops and other utilities. In 2020, your co-op had a large limb fall from a tree on federal lands onto one of your power lines, sparking a fire. Tell us how the challenge of wildfires affects you and the people you serve, and has it become a bigger problem in recent years?
Wildfires have become one of the most pressing issues utilities are facing in the Northwest. We've seen a dramatic increase in both the frequency and the intensity of wildfire across the region. A powerful reminder of wildfire risk we face came for WOEC in September of 2020, when a fire was sparked by one of our power lines and spread rapidly through steep forested terrain and forced evacuations in the area. Thanks to the efforts of local fire crews, it was contained around 126 acres, and miraculously, no structures were lost. But that event did fundamentally change how we as a utility approach wildfire risk. Since then, we've really ramped up our investment in tools and technology. We've expanded our vegetation management and our rights of way and deepened our collaboration with emergency services to just be better prepared.
We just talked about a bill in Congress that could make it easier for co-ops to remove hazard trees and other vegetation near power lines. Tell us why keeping rights of way near power lines clear is so important to West Oregon Electric Cooperative.
Maintaining clear rights of way isn't just good practice, it's a matter of safety and reliability. We serve some of the most rugged, heavily forested areas in the state, and that means hazard trees are everywhere. All it takes is one dead tree falling onto a power line to spark a wildfire or take out power to hundreds of our members. The September 2020 fire I mentioned before really underscored this reality. We saw firsthand how quickly a fire can erupt in dry, windy conditions and how crucial it is to proactively manage vegetation before it becomes a hazard. Wildfire risk is only growing, and co-ops need the right tools to reduce that risk and respond quickly. We need more flexibility to manage vegetation and maintain our rights of way without being delayed by long approval processes. It's about enabling us to do the work we know is necessary to protect our members and keep our infrastructure safe. Keeping our rights of way near power lines clear is important to West Oregon because it's one of the most effective ways we can improve reliability and mitigate that risk of wildfire for the communities that we serve. When we have the ability to act quickly and maintain these areas, we're not just maintaining infrastructure, we're safeguarding lives and property.
Great. And we talked about this some earlier, but again, what are some of the challenges you kind of encounter in tree trimming and vegetation management? What are some of the things that make it harder and how could it be made easier?
Our service territory is a challenge. Our service territory covers parts of 5 counties. It's spread over 1,200 square miles. And as I mentioned, just really rugged terrain with lots of trees and lots of gravel roads. So, accessing remote areas often means navigating steep slopes, dense woods, and rough back roads. It's tough on the equipment and it takes time, especially when you're trying to move the crews safely in and out. We also have power lines that run along major highways, which brings its own set of challenges. Tree trimming in those areas requires careful coordination with highway authorities to manage traffic control, lane closures, and just overall worker safety. It adds another layer of complexity and cost to an already challenging job. It can also be difficult to find and retain skilled vegetation management crews, especially those who are willing to work in remote, high risk areas like ours. With rising wages, fuel prices, equipment cost, and insurance, every mile of line we maintain is a major investment. And although it's an enormous commitment of resources, with safety and reliability in mind, it remains a top priority for us.
How much money and time does West Oregon Electric Cooperative spend every year on vegetation management? I mean, this sounds like a huge investment. Just how much of a piece of your operations is that generally?
We budget around $2 million annually for vegetation management. It's a pretty major investment for a utility of our size. We operate a year round tree trimming program with the goal of clearing every part of our system on a 5-year cycle. On top of that, we also perform targeted patrols after storms or high wind events to find and fix potential hazards before they become problems. Doing so is a core part of our wildfire mitigation plan, which outlines how we prioritize risk, adapt to changing conditions, and allocate our resources to reduce fire danger for our communities. Reliability is also at top of mind. Most of our outages are tree related, so by investing in vegetation management upfront, we're avoiding much more expensive and disruptive outcomes down the road.
And I know you also have some other really cool technology that helps guard against wildfires. I think I've seen some pictures of those. Can you describe some of the other kind of measures you're taking or equipment you're investing in to protect against wildfires?
Yeah, we've really stepped up our wildfire prevention efforts with a mix of tools and technology that will help us respond faster. Our most recent addition is a fire suppression trailer. It's a fully equipped mobile unit with a 500-gallon water tank, pump hoses, and other firefighting gear. The beauty of it is our crews can take it right to the job site. So if a small fire were to break out, we can act fast and potentially stop it before it gets out of control instead of waiting for a fire truck to arrive. We also have a solar powered remote automated weather station, or a RAWS. Gives us real time local weather data like wind, temperature, and humidity. That information helps us make decisions about daily work plans and fire risk, or even public safety power shutoffs. On the vegetation side, we have invested in a heavy duty mower from Caterpillar that can handle thick brush and small trees in our rights of way. That helps us clear fire prone areas more efficiently and bring our rights of way all the way down to the ground. We also use drones to inspect the lines in hard to reach areas, and our outage management system helps us respond quickly when something goes wrong, especially during fire season. We've also equipped high risk areas of our system with smart reclosures that we can switch to non reclose mode during high risk days, which help prevent a fault from sparking a fire. And we're also keeping an eye on some of the new fire detection technology that's coming out. There are some promising tools on the horizon that could give us even more visibility into our system and warning.
That's a pretty wide array of tools. It's very impressive and, obviously takes a lot of ingenuity and work. What advice would you give a co-op looking to make more of these investments?
Wildfire risk isn't going away. In fact, it's only intensifying in our region in particular. My advice to other co-ops would be to build strong partnerships with local fire departments, emergency managers, forestry officials, and even neighboring utilities. The more connected you are before something happens, the more effective your response will be when it counts. At West Oregon, we've worked hard to strengthen those relationships, so we're not starting from scratch if a fire does break out. We also coordinate closely during fire season, sharing updates, aligning on communication, and working from the same playbook. The other key piece is member engagement. Our members aren't just customers, they're part of the community we're trying to protect. So we make a point to keep them informed about fire risk, safety protocols, what we're doing to prepare. And just as important, we encourage them to do their part, whether it's creating defensible space around their homes or being ready for potential power shutoffs during higher risk weather. Preparation isn't just about infrastructure, it's about people. And the more you involve your members and your local partners, the stronger and more resilient your community becomes.
Excellent advice. That's a lot to think on, and I think there's a lot of good action items in there for both co-ops and consumer members. Billi, thanks for joining us to talk about this important issue.
Thank you, Molly.
And thanks to you, our listeners, and our sponsor, Hendricks by Marmon Utility. For more on this and other podcasts, visit us at electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Molly Christian.
I'm Kirby Jordan from ODEC in Glen Ellen, Virginia. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.